Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to this last day of the second International Agrobiodiversity Conference, Eat, Grow, Save. Today is the day of save, and it's not as less important from the other days. In fact, you cannot eat or you cannot grow what you don't have. And that's why saving is so important. Today, we're going to hear from distinguished scientists and panelists what it takes to save and the complexity of it. There are several options and several actions that are required in this space, and it's important that what is saved actually flows and goes into the grow and eventually ends up in our table. So it's a process. We are gonna have a first keynote speech from a very distinguished professor from the Pontificia Università Javeriana. But before going into her keynote, into her introductory remark that will set the stage for the day, I would like to emphasize one important part of the conservation space. In fact, as we know, a lot of the agrobiodiversity has been lost, and a lot of the traditional knowledge also attached to it is in the verge of being lost. We know that we have huge problems, and we've heard also from the previous day related to diets, for example, and health issues associated with diets because of insufficient biodiversity in our plates. We know that the environment has been degraded to an extent that the production is made increasingly difficult for ourselves. And we know that agriculture is triggering about 30% of the total greenhouse gas emission. And we know that the victims of these processes are the smallholder farmers around the world, who are paying the most vulnerable, who are paying the highest price of this loss of biodiversity, this loss of resilience, this loss of adapting options. So the safe space is really important as a guarantee, as an insurance mechanism for the smallholder communities to thrive. In addition to that, the smallholder communities, the indigenous people, are custodians not only of the seeds and the planting material, reproductive material, of the strains, of the diversity that is needed for this system to remain resilient, but also of the knowledge attached to it. And a lot of this knowledge is actually relevant if you want to go back into production systems that are more resilient. So now, without further ado, and that is what the day will really be about, discussing these issues. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Brigitte Baptiste. Brigitte Baptiste is a Colombian biologist who graduated from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. She has a master's degree in tropical conservation and development from the University of Florida. She is Doctor Honoris Causa in environmental management from UniPaz, and she has been a director for 10 years of the Alexander Vorhoopton Biological Resource Center Institute. And currently she serves as a rector of the Ian University, an institution of higher education focused on sustainable entrepreneurship. She is definitely an expert on environmental and biodiversity issues. She's an important leader in gender diversity. She's recognized for her participation in international conferences related to these issues. She was chosen for launching the day as one of the 25 world experts of the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Her currently chairs the Scientific Policy Advisory Committee of the Inter-American Environmental Initiative for Global Change, and she's an active member of the Scientific Committee of the Global Program PECS, Ecosystem Change and Society. In 2018, in addition, she also received the Fulbright Award for Excellence in Colombia, and in 2019, the award for the Exemplary Colombian Environment category. Some of the most significant bets are related to the local and global community of the current university. That was a transformational approach that she had of the educational model of the university she's currently chairing. And nature-based solutions became one of the most important changes that are permeating the teaching, the research, and the extension projects that are in the university portfolio. She's recently been involved in several projects related to gender equality and inclusion, launching a fund to support LGBTI and transgender people to access higher education. She has participated in the campaign Endema, National School for Unlearning Machismo for Colombia, to say no to gender violence and yes to equality, led by delegation of the European Union in this country. So without further ado, I now pass the floor.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at this second Agrobiodiversity Congress. And I would like to share some thoughts about global genetic security, which is a term that perhaps you have been familiar with in the past. It's the way we look at the global uh, insurance that genetic resources mean for food and health maintenance in the world, in all societies. And what I would like to emphasize is how global genetic security is an ecosystem service, and the frame of ecosystem services should be used to ensure that this conservation of genetic resources is real, is something that is relevant for policymakers, and it receives the attention and resources that we need to provide the service. Uh, Genetic diversity is linked and relies on ecological processes, and those ecological processes are able to maintain healthy populations of all species. Uh, Gene protection has been portrayed as one of the many ecosystem services we enjoy from nature, although it seems to have been largely underestimated in national conservation policies and especially in protected area management, probably because it's linked to the most complex ecological functions of all, which is keeping evolution alive. Therefore, we may need to emphasize genetic security as one of the key features behind food security and the cost of not valuing and investing well in it. And I here mention protected areas because in the world we are reaching, I think, a nice level of land protection and ocean protection under the CBD uh, directions and goals. But the argument for genetic protection is a very wide one. It's a kind of a shadow kind of value for ecosystem conservation, and it's not very well developed. Uh, Here, as an example, you see the protected areas and indigenous lands in the Amazon basin for South America. In green, you see those protected areas that provide many ecosystem services from different levels of wilderness. And in yellow and orange, you see which are native territories that also provide ecosystem services, but mediated by cultural understanding of them. But if you really try to look at which genetic resources are located in each of those chunks of land that represents at least half of the Amazon, you'll have trouble. It's not that easy. And in fact, most of the resources are being destroyed and being destroyed mostly and paradoxically to increase the land availability for food production. So you see lots of genetic resources in protected areas, and but the encroachment and the destruction of those same genetic resources that need to be used in the case of agricultural development of those lands. And a very particular example from my country in Colombia, you'd see in the white circles two national biological reserves that were declared in the 90s to specifically protect genetic resources for the future. They account for at least 2 million hectares of primary forest in the middle of one of the richest ecosystems north of the Amazon. This is rainforest, but mostly linked to the Guyana Shield. And in fact, those places are almost, would say, abandoned or completely forgotten by the state. There are just a couple of inventories made of their um, botany in the at the beginning of the management plan, and they are now even without any uh, guardian or any police or anybody in charge. So 2 million hectares of genetic resources mostly left to their own fate. And they're both located in a region where domestication of cassava and pineapple were done, and there's plenty of genetic diversity for the future. Here you see on the red and yellow spots the um, increased pressure from colonists coming from the Andean region looking for land, looking for options, and they are so close to these genetic reserves that we are afraid that we'll start losing this in, uh, amazing volume of biodiversity. So we are start asking some questions about the science policy interface in relation to the conservation and the proper use of those genetic resources. Why are not we are not being able to protect those genetic resources, even if it is one of the most important arguments for conservation and for future of sustainable use of biodiversity? And I think there's at least 5 issues that we need to clarify. The first one is uh, that the relation between ecological functions and um, genetic diversity is not clear, and that the flow of benefits from this genetic diversity based on evolutionary processes is very difficult to grasp to the general public, not least to say to the decision makers. We talk about healthy populations immersed in healthy ecological communities at many scales, but people doesn't catch the link of those words with the benefits they get on the dish, for example, on the everyday's life. So evolution and well-being is not very well connected. Then there's very little evidence on the levels of ecological integrity which is required to prevent genetic erosion. So people say, well, 1 million hectares in the middle of the Amazon, why not make 500,000? Why not make 200,000? Why we need so much land to left to the wild when there's pressing economic issues going around? We need land, we need wood, we need uh, new cities, expansion of infrastructure. So why is that we need so large space and long times to protect evolution? And that's again because people doesn't understand what means evolutionary processes. Also, we need a bit of guidelines on how those evolutionary processes uh, work in at everyday's life. We need to bring evidence of how beans were produced from the wild in the past, with or without local communities, because domestication happened in very different moments of history with very different strategies, and it's still going on because of different types of processes. So this link of on how to protect pineapple and cassava, wild relatives of those species, is linked to the evidence that those species are still alive in those protected areas. And usually, if we don't have good inventories or at least information to show that here there's a potato, a wild relative of modern potatoes, it will be very difficult to convince anybody that this place deserves protection and the resource needs or keeps behaving in terms of evolutionary adaptation. And that's fundamental if we want to face climate change or disasters or other unexpected outcomes of human development. So awareness of changes in the genetics of the wild species is very important to convey to policymakers, and you need to talk about the demand and supply relations of those resources. Why and who is interested in those genes? Because usually the narratives goes to discovery of new medicines based on a microbe or in a seed or in a non-explored species, which we know it's fake. It doesn't work like that. Uh, what it works, it's a permanent assessment of the genetic diversity in the ecosystems and how we connect to that in a more permanent way. And which institutions are doing these jobs, such as CGR and seed banks and gene banks? What's the relation of this in situ with ex situ conservation that we already know is quite important? And finally, policy makers are interested in to know which instruments have been already successful and how much they cost to the public to see if they invest or decide to direct public investments in biological reserves or management plans of wilderness, because this has a political price as well. So those are what I identified as the main questions for analyzing this relation of genetic conservation and well-being. So inspired in a kind of an old document of 2006 from WWF, I extracted some remaining challenges and gaps for the conservation of genetic resources linked to food production and health, of course. And I focus on four issues. The issue of knowledge, of course, already mentioned that we need to promote conservation of crop wild relatives in protected areas, even facing poor inventories. So we have to convince everybody that protected areas have the resources of the future, like this book mentions that they are food stores. But this needs a very good narrative, needs lots of education and examples to promote engagement from different stakeholders and sectors of the society. Then it comes the economics of conservation and the trade-off between doing something and not doing something. How do we calculate how much money, public or private, can be used in support of in situ genetic conservation? So here, by example, here in Colombia, we have plenty of relatives of uh, rice, but not at the level of species. So it's kind of difficult to use this genetic resource of the gender, the genus, towards improving the quality of rice. But at some point, we will need to go that far. But who's uh, putting the money? Then equity, of course, lots of communities are arguing that they are preserving genetic resources, so that they need a kind of a compensation. They need to be part of policies that really acknowledge their role on genetic diversity conservation and production. So there's lots of policies involved in the issue of equity, which is the role of everybody's in this task. And some risks that are emerging in these times when we are talking lots about of restoration, regeneration, reintroduction of species in some places that need to be um, populated again with species that are endangered or that are useful. But here we are talking about lots of genetic modification, not necessarily by means of biotechnology, but different ways of domestication. We are building new genetic ensembles and communities, and we don't know very much about them. Finally, to emphasize this idea of genetic security management, I think that we could consider wider adoption of the concept that the people is not aware that we are facing a threat, and this is a global threat, which is going to be overlapped with the and feed by the climate change challenges. So we need to strengthen cooperation for adaptation in supporting this on how to face this challenge. We need clear orientation uh, for the protected areas that really they are able to preserve the wild relatives, because protected areas are designed for everything, and people now is starting to be fed by this idea that protected areas are nice places for tourism, for protecting nature, but they don't really grasp the power of nature's protection in the form of parks, reserves, and so on. We don't know the behavior of these genetic flows within natural protected areas or in the wild, and we don't know very little of the amount of this genetic diversity being preserved on seed banks, botanical gardens, other facilities, and we don't know how those banks are contributing to restoring and building again some levels of complexity in the wild. So there's a mutual relation that it's now complicated. It's being discussed widely. How are we going to pay for genetic diversity maintenance? Is that a kind of particular ecosystem service payment? In which form? How much? To which communities or other stakeholders? But if it is an issue of security, we may need some incentives for protecting the genetic diversity which is located in specific places of the world. And finally, which kind of policy adjustments we need to protect and improve this security in the world. So who is helping who at with which or in which conditions this relation developed, and to know much more about the gene flow worldwide. And this pandemics has shown us how complex but how important is the capacity of following genes throughout the territory. So to finish, I think that we need to ensure healthy environments where the exchanges of genes within wild relatives and well, could be edible plants or animals, but also between in situ and ex situ stocks are understood or managed. There's few examples, good examples worldwide of this relation, but still we need to emphasize how conservation really is working well to protect genetic resources in the future. We need to make sure that we have the capacity to improve the knowledge of this relation of genetic resources and conservation with food production, and not just from plants, but also from microbial diversity, which is linked to ecological functions. There's lots of research done on the nutrient cycling, soil chemistry modifications, the control of emerging diseases by microbes, fungus, or bacteria, and we need to really have this ecological awareness and monitoring capabilities installed on every country and even for every ecosystem. And finally, how to develop this or to improve this public and institutional awareness of the risks of undermining these adaptive capacities of the world's biotic assets. So messing with evolution can really be a risky business. Thank you very much.